second part, and I just knew I had to read it. So again, this is the second part of the scary story that I'm reading from Reddit's r/NoSleep, and the user is Zenru45. The link is in the description for the actual Reddit post and their credit. Please do give them some credit. Anyway, this is part 2. If you haven't seen part 1, go check that out first, because we're going to be following up. This one is a little bit longer, but hopefully you're in for the ride, and we're going to get through this together, and it will be great. But without further ado, I think we should get into this story. Once again, printed out into a real human book, but that is okay. That is fine, because we're gonna get into it. There is luckily a quick recap, just in case you've forgotten. Okay, so the title of this story is I'm a Phony Paranormal Investigator and I'm in Over My Head. Again, posted on Reddit NoSleep by Zenru45. Here we go. A quick recap. After my home inspector job disappeared due to the pandemic, I found a new career. Using my trade skills, tools, and well-researched paranormal investigator act, I helped people who thought their homes were haunted. At the time, I assumed all the hauntings were just bad wiring, leaky insulation, and creaky pipes, playing on the imagination. That changed when my latest client and I were attacked by a genuine poltergeist. As luck would have it, some of the parts of my paranormal investigator job worked for real, and we were able to escape with our lives. Sorry it took me so long to post a follow-up. I'm having to type this one-handed on an iPad from a hospital bed, which is more difficult and frustrating than you'd think. It took me a while to get everything written down, and boy, there is a lot to tell. Before I get into the story, I want to give a big thank you to everyone who contacted me and offered assistance. I came to the internet for help and you guys came through. Thank you all. There was one person in particular who had a wealth of knowledge. I'll relay their message here. Dear Peter, you're one lucky SOB. You seriously need to go buy a lotto ticket after all this. Had events not played out exactly the way they did, you would have not lived to tell the tale. As it turns out, you were right about a few key things. Some paranormal entities, like the one you're up against, do in fact feed on fear. Winston, getting himself and his family out of the house, kept the Kruger, I'll explain what that is in a few minutes, from being able to feed on the fear. Salt, burning sage, and ruins work, but they're only part of it. Congratulations, you're a wizard, Peter. Sort of. They're a form of ritualistic magic, the sort of magic anyone can do. Again, sort of. There are limits to what information I can give you without upsetting the people around me, but I can tell you the gist of it. Ritualistic magic works by intention and collective willpower. In essence, they work as long as people, yourself included, want to/believe they work. Add a bit of powdered silver to your salt. Now, I used the term Kruger before, I'll explain it. Again, sorry, I can't tell you everything. The company I work for has some very strict rules. The name Kruger is in reference to Freddy Krueger from Nightmare on Elm Street, although it's a bit of a misnomer. He was a dream demon, and that's very different from what you're up against, thankfully. A Kruger can be created when a murderer dies in a particularly violent manner in or near the location of their murders. Like, say, being burned alive in the boiler room where the victims were kept. The hate and anger of the Kruger can persist and mix in with the lingering fear and despair of the victims. This causes the spirit to become the type of poltergeist known as a Kruger. As a Kruger, they can feed on fear to grow in power and project telekinetic force, like holding the door closed, create solidified shadow matter, the branches you mentioned, mimic voices and screams, project electromagnetic fields which can disrupt electronics, control self-solidity, change how solid they are, and feed on thermal energy. Usually ambient heat, but sometimes body heat. Hopefully you got that toe checked out. Once we got away from the manor, I did have Nurse Winston have a look at it. When I got my boot off, we discovered the toe in question was shriveled, pale, and I couldn't move it. Some sort of skin on the tip had turned necrotic and had to be removed. Winston was able to treat it, so don't worry, I'll be fine. However, he couldn't really explain what the injury was. The best he could come up with was an acute sudden onset hypothermia. I shudder thinking about what might have happened if the poltergeist had managed to grab the rest of my foot. I probably would have never made it up the stairs to escape with Winston. The note continued. On to the good stuff now, namely vulnerabilities. Banishing runes can hurt them, even destroy them if you can weaken them enough. Salt barriers can trap them, or act as a shield. Burning sage can cleanse their presence. If you can remove every trace of them from the home, they'll be gone for good. Another ritual magic, like blessed water, can disperse their energies, the same way that the banishment runes do. Keep in mind, you can't just buy holy water off of eBay. You have to have someone that genuinely understands the threat you're up against, bless the water, or find an already blessed object and submerge it. Silver objects work best. Once the water is blessed, it will remain so for a few hours, and it will retain the blessing regardless of form, as in liquid, frozen, solid, or even water vapor. I hope this information helps you. Egon. Figures they'd pick that name. I suppose we did need to complete the pseudonym collection. I was able to confirm what Egon had said with other paranormal researchers I contacted through Reddit. I spent some time looking into this company Egon mentioned, but lacking any other details to go on. Other than having pressing issues to deal with, I decided to move on. One of the most common suggestions I received was to find a priest or exorcist. I had initially dismissed such a notion, as I am an atheist and didn't believe in such things. Of course, then I remembered I hadn't believed in ghosts either, until just recently, so perhaps I needed to be a little more open-minded. I was able to track down a few exorcists, but due to COVID-related travel restrictions, none of them could get here to help anytime soon. I had mentioned the need for an exorcist or some type of blessed object to Winston, and it turned out he had one already. I examined the small silver Star of David pendant. It was a little token of Winston's faith he always wore. I didn't know much about jewelry, but I sensed it was old. In fact, it had some sort of heaviness to it beyond its material substance, as if I could feel the weight of its history. Winston explained, that used to belong to my great-great-grandfather. He was a rabbi. Do you think it will work? I shrugged at Winston. Well, in theory, it should work, but I don't have any objective way of measuring blessedness. He frowned for a moment, and then his eyes lit up excitedly. Scan it with your energy detector, Gizmo, he suggested. It took a moment for me to figure out what he meant. Oh, my electromagnetic field detector, you mean? He nodded. Keep in mind, while Winston was a top-rate medical professional, he lacked a solid understanding of electronics. He could use a computer just fine, but anytime he had a problem with one, he'd have his wife Dana to fix it. I let out a little chuckle as I fetched my EM detector. I don't think this gizmo does what you think it does. You're probably using its PKE meter like Ghostbusters, but it detects EM fields. I switched it on and waved it over the pendant to show him, and was quite surprised when the device lit up like Las Vegas Strip, and chirped wildly like a nest of hungry hatchlings. I stood there, stunned for a moment. It didn't make sense. There had to be some sort of electron flow, magnetism to create an EM field. I experimented trying to figure out if it was some sort of trick, but it didn't seem to be. There weren't any hidden electronics or magnets, and I couldn't think of any reason my friend would try to deceive me. What the heck? I asked, with an arched eyebrow. Winston just smiled and replied, See, I knew it would work. Have faith in his power, like my dad always said. There was something oddly comforting in the way he said that. Janie, Winston's 20-year-old daughter, wanted to join us for the exorcism. Winston and I were hesitant as this was a very serious possibility, even deadly matter we were dealing with, but we didn't want her getting hurt, or worse. But on the other hand, she was old enough to make her own decisions, and she was in good physical shape condition thanks to her years of playing lacrosse. She could easily outrun both of us, and frankly we needed all the help we could get, and there was only a few people that would believe us about the real-life haunted house. So we agreed to take her along, but convinced her to stay outside and act as our runner/equipment manager. Based on the suggestions of commenters and discussions with other paranormal researchers, I came up with a few ideas on how we were going to combat the poltergeist. I will outline them here. We go on a day with 0% chance of rain and arrive at dawn. Every source I found agrees most paranormal entities can't stand sunlight for whatever reason. We're going to take all the doors off the hinges. Winston had tried using a rope to hold the basement door open, but that didn't work, so we'll remove them completely. One guy had a great idea. Rent spotlights and inscribe the banishing rune on them. Unfortunately, there aren't any stores around here that have spotlights. Someone else suggested workman lights, and that reminded me I already had 3 heavy-duty freestanding workman's lights in my basement. The really big ones that are powered by car batteries. The owner of the company I worked for pre-pandemic let me have them after the business went under. They were a little old and needed some fixing, but with Dana's help, it turns out she's a school shop teacher. We got the working almost now. We'll position 2 of the mega photon busters, or MBPs, at the front back doors. This in case we needed to make a quick exit. We know the poltergeist likes to put up the shadow matter barriers. Hopefully the MBPs are able to prevent that. I also make sure to protect them with assault circles, just in case. Winston will carry the 3rd MBP with us. Dana was able to get some of the headset radios, so we'll be able to use these to coordinate with each other. A few people recommended holy water-filled squirt guns. That was a good idea, but I came up with an even better one. More props. I made extra photon busters and bottles of magic-infused salts. I even managed to get some powdered silver dirt cheap to mix in with the salt. I made sure to make a big show of it so the others would believe they worked, just as Aegon suggested. The battle plan was simple and straightforward. We get in and burn sage in every room, including the hidden one. According to Aegon, if we could remove every trace of... I suppose he needed a name. Let's stick with the current naming convention and call him Vigo. If we could cleanse every trace of Vigo, it would be gone for good. Of course, doing the big cleansing ritual with superpowered poltergeist of serial killers stalking us at every turn, it was likely easier said than done. But hey, at least we had salt and flashlights. That was something. We pulled into Winston's driveway the day of, just as the lazy orange-red dawn began to give way to the clear blue sky. I parked my truck and shut off the engine, but I didn't get out right away. I didn't see anyone coming of Winston's van either. I know why we hesitated. Even outside the house, in the relative safety of our vehicles, we could feel it. The dark aura of the presence within the home. It's hard to describe. It was like a stain on my emotions. Just being within proximity of the manor, I felt a continuous surging shudder of fear. It was the fear that exact moment when you're first startled, and before you've had the chance to really see whatever really spooked you. Think of it as one instant, just as the jump scare in the creepy video happens. Imagine if someone paused the video at the exact point, and it paused your reaction as well, causing the feeling to linger, and you couldn't get past it. You know, just past that instant is a relief. The moment where you laugh at yourself for falling for it. But we couldn't reach that point. The dark presence kept us locked in that instant fear of horror. I took a long breath and remembered, fake it till you make it. I forced a smile as I spoke to my radio headset. draw a salt barrier if you think something is coming. Also, don't forget to turn on every faucet you find. This is like a moving house. It's a big scary job to start with, but once you get into it, you realize it won't be bad. Heck, we can even have a beer and a pizza after, Janie replied. Let's have a Chinese instead. Dad always insists on putting pineapple and anchovies. I heard a laugh at that, then Winston protesting. Hey, pineapple and anchovy on pizza are awesome. I could hear the smile in his voice. I chuckled a little and realized the oppressive aura didn't feel quite so bad now. I'm a big into pepperoni myself, but Chinese food will be fine. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the truck. Winston and Janie began unloading and setting up the equipment. While I walked around the backyard, I looked down at the small Star of David pendant my friend had loaned me. It was hard to believe this tiny thing could hold any real power, but it was worth trying. So, at this point you're probably wondering what my better idea for holy water was. Well, I'll explain it. You see, most urban homes are on city water, but places way out in the woods of the manor tend to have wells and subterranean water reserves somewhere on the property. In this case, the well was somewhere in the backyard. I found an access panel and pried it open, then carefully lowered the pendant down into the water via the ball of twine I had already attached it to. I managed to tie the other end securely to be able to retrieve it later, if the process of submerging a blessed object into water works the way Ego described. And at the time, it was a giant freaking if. Then this would cause every drop of water pumped into the house to become blessed. As we took the big lights and the outer doors off their hinges, I felt something wet hit my cheek. If I hadn't already been on edge, I might not have noticed. I looked up and saw grey clouds rolling in overhead at an unnatural speed. I blinked in disbelief. This couldn't be happening. We checked and rechecked. There was no chance for rain today. That's why we were doing this now. Winston and Janie noticed I was looking up at the sky and they matched my gaze. How? Winston asked disbelievingly. There was only one answer I could come up with. It's him. I then clarified. Vico is doing it somehow. He knows the sunlight can help us, so he's blocking it out. Janie gave me a nervous look and asked, He can do that? I could tell both she and Winston were beginning to lose hope, so I put on my act. Yeah, he can. It's a mix of telekinesis and EM manipulation. I tried to sound confident, but it was difficult because I was just guessing. But don't lose heart, this is a good sign. I tried to sound convincing. They both gave me a look of confusion and disbelief, though. I floundered a bit as I tried to come up with the reason for why it was a good sign. While Vigo has decades to gather energy by creating fear, he can only create so much, meaning there's a limit. You gotta figure pulling out a rainstorm is gonna take a lot of energy out, right? That means he's using up a lot of juice just to block out one part of our overall plan. This, I pointed to our now cloudy sky as the drops began falling in a mass, is a desperation play. The more energy we can make him use up, the weaker he'll be. My half-cocked rationalizing ended up making sense based on what I knew. Janie and Winston looked convinced and both seemed bolstered, which was good. I couldn't let them be scared, or that would let Vigo get more fuel. Of course, I couldn't let myself get scared either. I didn't have the benefit of the expert offering reassurances. Winston and I proceeded carefully through the front door. We began burning sage, and in every room cleansed the oppressiveness of the dark aura. It began to lessen. It was just when we got to the first bathroom, we heard a familiar, ear-splitting scream. It was loud enough Winston and I both winced in pain. I noticed I felt sort of a compulsion to stop what I was doing and go find the source. In fact, had we not expected Vigo to pull this exact trick, I might have. I understood why Winston had run to the basement the first time. We exchanged a knowing look and went back to our tasks. was about to start running to call when he answered by a different genie's voice. That wasn't me. The ghost must be messing with us. Everything is pineapples out here, Dad. Winston looked slightly relieved as he took a few breaths to calm himself. Then he went to check her through the window just in case. I see her standing next to the work light in the salt circle. She's fine. He sounded relieved. The fake voice of Janie began begging for help, but I interrupted it and tried to go for a sort of half-bluff. Give it up, Vigo. We knew you'd try and mess with the radios, so we've devised a code system beforehand. Right, Anchovies? Like I said, half-bluff. Janie had cleverly come up with one on the fly. The real Janie had answered back. That's a 10-4 bacon and pep. The radio fell to static again, and there was a brief burst of loud static. It was like a hiss of an angry animal, and then nothing. I looked back at my friend. Let's finish up the ground floor and then move on to the basement. As we passed the thermostat in the main hallway, I turned it up to an extra 20 degrees. This was for two reasons. First, it had gotten really cold the last time Vigo started sucking up all the ambient heat. Second, it was to help spread the water vapor around the house. This goes back to one of those bits of home inspector wisdom. Mold grows best in warm and wet environments. In particular, mold tends to take root during the winters, when heating systems blow around heated, moist winter air from the outside. I hoped to mimic the effect with, hopefully, blessed water flowing from every tap. It wasn't a proven idea, but the concept made sense. Well, as much sense as anything else I was planning on doing that day. The kitchen was still an absolute mess. When we finally got there, it was worse now because the spilled contents in the upside-down fridge had gotten time to rot. I wasn't wearing my mask this time around, so I got a nose full of the awful smell. Frankly, I just assumed to spare you the description, as I wish I could forget it. There was probably no saving the tile floor. It would have to be ripped out and replaced by something. The smell would never leave. I looked up at the knives. They were still stuck on the ceiling. And then the realization hit me. I called out to Winston. Stay out of the kitchen. I'm going to try something. He poked his head in to give me a questioning look, then nodded. I drew a circle of salt and a set of protection runes, then stepped inside. I called out to the house in general. That wasn't the spot, was it? I gestured to the knives. That's where they strung you up and let you dangle till your feet stopped kicking, right? I felt a sort of hostile pressure against the back of my mind, and the shadows in the room deepened. Some of them pressed onto the circle, but they were unable to penetrate. I looked up at the window and saw the rain had eased up a bit. I was inspired to try something. Maybe I could goad Vigo into using up more of his energy. Must have come as a real shock. Your brother and the mayor managed to save your sorry butt every time except the last. As I recall from my research, they ran out of time before they got rid of you. I felt the hostile pressure grow and grow more as the shadows pressed against the salt circle. Over the radio I hear Jeannie report. Hey, the rain's starting to lighten up. I guess whatever you're doing in there is working. I forced a cocky grin and stood up taller. I noticed the shadows pressing against my circle were getting worse, so I took out my photon blaster and projected the ruin upon them. The floor shook, suddenly as if I startled something, perhaps painfully. The shadows retreated. Ooh, I bet that hurt. I called out and heard an angry hiss of static over the radio as the shadows pressed up against the circle even thicker than before. They pushed and pushed, but they couldn't get through the salt barrier. I was hoping Vigo was burning up a lot of energy trying. I cut the shadows off with a photon blaster again, drawing a distant scream from somewhere below me. I called out arrogantly, "You're gonna lose, Vigo. It might take us time, but we'll drive you out completely eventually. We've got plenty of salt, sage, and batteries. You don't have anyone you can scare anymore. Your loss is as inevitable as your neck getting snapped when they put a rope around it." The hostile pressure eased off as the shadows receded. For a moment, I let myself believe I had bullied the poster poltergeist into giving up. That was when things went to hell. There was a loud crash from somewhere in the front yard, and a moment later Janie shouted through the radio. Something just threw an end table at one of our lights. It's totally smashed. There was a loud clang sound in the backyard. Through the back window, I watched as the other mega PB sending it flying. Vigo must have thrown those things, but that didn't make sense. They were protected by salt circles. True, the rain might have washed some of the salt away or caused it to soak into the ground, but that shouldn't have removed the salt's protections. The only way to break a salt circle is to step on it or scatter the salt, so there was no longer defined line. I heard something creak overhead and looked up at the knives at the ceiling and realized a few of them were now missing. I hadn't heard them hit the floor. It occurred to me perhaps the salt barriers, while perfectly suited for keeping out spectral entities, might not necessarily stop mundane objects thrown by paranormal forces. I got lucky. The first knife hit my belt buckle and bounced off. Any higher, and I would have been trying to hold my guts in. Any lower, and I'd be singing soprano. I stumbled backward onto the circle. A second knife flew through the air, and it painfully sliced across my arm. "Winston, bring the gun!" I cried out as I grabbed the lid of a pot that was sitting above the stove, just used to deflect the next blade. I heard scrambling sounds and heavy footsteps from out the hallway. I felt a sudden pull on my improvised shield, and it was torn out of my hand, leaving me defenseless as two more knives hovered nearby, as if held by unseen hands. I was backed into the corner, where there was nowhere to run. The knives drove in closer, moving, as if the invisible figure was preparing to strike. I brought my arms up to shield myself as a last-ditch effort. The blades were just about to stab me when there was a sudden pained inhuman scream and the weapons clattered to the floor. I felt the warmth of light and cautiously lowered my arms to look. I saw Winston holding our last mega PB, projecting the vanishing ruin at the spot where my invisible attacker had been. "Thanks, Winston," I called out as I tried to catch my breath. I had just a split second to compose myself before I suddenly fell to the floor, under my feet sink and then collapse. I fell screaming into the darkness of the basement below. I heard Winston call my name above me. I think he looked down the hole I fell through to check on me, and yelled, "Hold on, I'm coming for you." Then heard his pounding footsteps running to the basement door. The crash landing knocked the wind out of me and left me disoriented. I needed a moment to regain my senses. I looked up and saw the support beams of the floor were exposed and ripped to shreds. As I peered around the rest of the room, I noticed similar damage to the ceiling in every spot. That would equate to 4 corners in the kitchen above us. Pit traps, I thought. Vigo must have figured we'd come back, more prepared for a fight, so he decided to prepare one as well. I blinked as the thought hit me. I felt my stomach sink. I shouted as loud as I could, "Winston, don't come down the stairs, they're probably—" I was interrupted by the sound of wood creaking, collapsing, and then Winston screaming. I scrambled to my feet in a panic. I was fine, albeit a bit sore, but my friend might be hurt. He was in a different area of the basement, but close enough by how loud the scream was. I spotted the door and ran toward it. I had just grasped the handle to turn it, when the way back of my neck was grabbed by an icy vice, and I was lifted into the air. The touch was so cold I felt it burning, and the pain felt gut-wrenchingly familiar. I gagged and tried to break free of whatever had me. It laughed and tossed me like I was an empty soda can, destined for the recycling bin. I had my second hard landing in less than a minute when I slammed into the wall and let out a pained groan as I felt something creak painfully in my shoulder. I leaned against the wall as it turned to look when it attacked me. It's difficult to describe Vigo. In the, well, not flesh. He was a shadow standing in the middle of the room, like those movie helpers in the green suits that get chroma keyed out. I could see the outline of the unnaturally lanky and tall figure perfectly, save for the slight haze in my vision from the pain. He had to be at least 8 feet tall, with the very thin and elongated limbs that reminded me of a giant spider. I had lost my primary PB, so I pulled a spare from my belt to try to shine it on Vigo. He moved out of the way. I write the "moved" in quotes because you're probably thinking of something a human would do, like sidestep or jump out of the way. He moved like a liquid. His body melted onto the floor just before my beam touched him, and he emerged from the floor in front of me and violently swatted the flashlight from my hand, sending it clattering into the far corner of the room with a nerve-wracking whack. As the beam faded, he grabbed grabbed me by the throat with inhuman, impossible strength and bent me backward over some sort of metal surface. I remembered as I was struggling with him, I thought, why isn't he just killing me? It was obvious he could simply crush my neck outright and end it, but he chose not to, as I felt the fear of my impending doom well up my chest like a pot of boiling water threatening to blow the lid off. I figured it out. He was trying to scare me, to feed off me. I had arrogantly declared, you don't have anyone you can scare anymore, and he was trying to prove me wrong. I clamped down on the fear swelling in my chest. He wouldn't kill me till after he got all the fear from me. I figured so long as I didn't give him fear, he couldn't kill me. So, don't be afraid of the fact he's going to kill me, or he'll kill me. Funny how your mind works in a time of panic. Working on the reasoning of it. If he is solid enough to hit me, he must be solid enough to hit. I slid my trusty wrench from the sheath of my belt, pulled it back, and swung into his head as hard as I could. He didn't even react, like he noticed it bounced off. So solid enough to hit, but not necessarily possessing pain receptors or vulnerable internal organs. I reached for my salt bottle next, but it wasn't in the pouch. I looked around and saw a giant pile of salt nearby. Evidently, it had broken my fall and exploded in the process. Lacking any other options, I decided to try hitting him with the wrench again, but this time, as I pulled back, I heard it hit something metal next to me. I glanced over and realized Vigo had been pinned me to the sink. I was just able to turn the faucet on, causing the water to flow. As luck would have it, there was a water pitcher nearby, but I couldn't reach far enough to get it under the tap. In another one of those moments of inspiration, I hooked the end of the wrench around the handle of the pitcher and used it to get under the tap. I heard the changing sound of falling water as it began to fill the vessel. I just needed a few seconds and for Vigo not to realize what I was doing. Unfortunately, Vigo had plans of his own. Not satisfied by my lack of fear, he changed his grip so that he could pin me with one hand and pull back the other to hit me. I shut my eyes tight and braced as I saw the surge forward. Now, people say the anticipation is worse than the pain. I'm certain that anyone that makes such claim has never had their humerus broken by a poltergeist. I not only heard the bone snap on impact, but also felt as if it were a shockwave of white-hot pain rumbling through my shoulder, up my neck, and right into my brain. I felt no shame in admitting I screamed. And there were tears in my eyes. Thankfully, he had broken my left arm, and the sink was to my right. I turned my cry of pain and swell of fear into a roar of defiance and a surge of anger. I pulled out the now full water pitcher. Contents, hitting him right in the face and neck. For a second, nothing happened. I felt my heart sink as I thought we had been wrong. Winston's pendant hadn't worked. Maybe Egon had really not known what he was talking about. I wondered in despair if this was it. Is he going to kill me now? Had my last desperate trick simply not worked? Then Vigo let a primal, earth-rattling scream as he stumbled backwards, and part of his head melted off. I literally watched as the shape of his head changed, as a chunk of the size of my fist dripped down like frosting on a melting cake and faded into nothing. I put the pitcher back under the tap to fill it up. I just needed to buy a few seconds while I did. I ran my wrench through the steam, hopefully allowing to pick up some of the holiness, then swung for Vigo's head again as he leapt at me. I connected with the skull again, and this time he felt it. He let another primal wall-shaking scream as bits of his face started to shatter off and his temple dented like someone crushing a beer can. I didn't give him a chance to recover. I grabbed a pitcher and tried to dose him again. He stepped back just as I let the water fly. I ended up tagging him on the belly, drawing another cry of pain, but he was able to back up to the wall to phase onto it. We were in a standoff now. The blessed water hurt him badly, and I had plenty to throw, but only the one pitcher, the one shot. I couldn't chase him down with it, because if I missed my shot, I'd have to go into defense. risking getting splashed again. Of course, I couldn't afford to wait for a chance to get him. Winston might be on the verge of death in another room, and I had to get to him. I decided to take a gamble and took the next full pitcher of water and poured it on myself. If I made the wrench an effective weapon, I reasoned it might give me the measure of protection. I went to fill the pitcher one last time, but suddenly the sink began to rumble and shudder violently. I backed away reflexively, and just barely avoided getting whacked as it was ripped clean off the wall and violently rose into the air and hung there for a moment. I screamed a profanity or two as I leapt away, losing the pitcher in the process. Vigo still had his telekinesis abilities. I could only guess the protection of the holy water was some inability to telekinetically affect people directly kept him from being able to force choke me, Vader style. The sink slammed down, crushing into the wall, cutting off the flow of holy water. I hated how smart the bad guy was. Everything we tried eventually figured out. A count or two, bigger lights, he breaks them. Holy water, he figures out how to cut off the supply. I was still trapped with him in the basement, and I needed to get to Winston, who might already be dead for all I knew. And I was down to the possible protection of holy-soaked water shirt, one good arm, and a wrench. I looked around for something, anything else I could use, and all that was left was a big pile of salt where I had originally fallen through the ceiling. I blinked at it and had an idea. I saw Vigo emerge from the wall. He was moving slower than before, but he was still coming at me. I scrambled over to the salt pile. It was roughly a circular pile, but 3 feet across, more than enough room for my whole body to fit. I drew a quick protection rune into the salt just as Vigo leapt at me and slammed into the invisible brick wall and splattered like a cartoon character. It would have been funny if I wasn't so horrified and pained in the moment. Apparently there was no need to draw lines of circles. You just needed salt. And the symbols. I didn't think it would work like this. Maybe it was because I added powered silver like Econ suggested. I still didn't know for sure. I was safe for the moment, but the situation hadn't really changed. I still needed to get Winston, and I still had no way past Vigo. He reformed in front of me, looking rather worse for wear. He had lost a foot in height, and his form kept shuddering and slipping out of shape, as if it were having trouble holding it together. He tried to hit me again, but his fist bounced off the barrier. I was safe, but trapped. I was panicking as I tried to think of my next move, but then I saw a familiar face peek through the window behind Vigo. The basement had well windows. She was able to lean down and look in it. Jeannie looked at Vigo, then to me, and gave me a determined nod. She popped back up, and a moment later I saw something, covered by a sheet being lowered down and aimed at Vigo. I wouldn't find out till afterward that Jeannie had not been idle while I was slugging it with Vigo. She tried to call us over with the radio, but we wouldn't answer. My radio was broken in the fall, and Winston's was being jammed. She tried to repair the 2 outside work lights, but unfortunately neither could be salvaged. It was then she noticed that the clouds had parted enough for the sun to shine again. Our guess is Vigo had used up so much energy he couldn't keep the storm going. There's a few better sources of light than the sun. Jeannie just needed a way of aiming it. She remembered that there was a dressing mirror in the shed. It was her mother's. The frame had been damaged, and Dana was working on restoring it. Using thin strips of electrical tape, Jeannie made a copy of the basement ruin across the mirror surface. After she heard my scream of when my arm was broken, she figured out I was somewhere in the basement, and checked every window till she found me. I caught a glimpse of the mirror's reflective surface as she was trying to line up the shot, and realized this was a chance to take a shot at Vigo, with what might have been our greatest weapon, but only so long as he didn't move. If he happened to catch on to what she was doing, he could move out of the line of sight of the window, rendering the weapon useless. So I had to figure out a way to keep him in place for a few seconds. I went with the first idea that came to my head. I decided to provoke him again, because, that worked out well the last time. I looked him right in where his eyes would have been, on his blank face, and laughed. I laughed a hard belly laugh, bouncing in the most aggravating way that my constantly hateable home inspector essence possibly could. It made the pain in my broken arm worse, but I committed to the act. Wow, literally all you had to do was kill me while you had the chance, and you blew suck at it. Vigo let an enraged roar and began pounding against the invisible barrier separating us. He was hitting so hard I felt the floor under me shake with every impact and noticed bits of his hands flaking off. He was essentially grinding himself into dust just to get me. I saw Janie reaching down to pull the cover off the mirror. Vigo's scream of pain was less sound and more force. Think of a volcano that just stepped on a Lego brick while stubbing its toe. The sheer power of the shook the house so much it was knocked off the foundation by an entire inch. I was forced into the fetal position in a futile attempt to block it all out. I only got a brief look. The instant after the scream faded, but before Vigo vanished into nothing. There were pieces of him missing. Every bit of him that had been touched by the projecting, banishing ruin was simply erased. He looked like a stick figure. Someone took whiteout brush too. I would have expected him to fall to pieces. I watched as the little of him was left faded away like the mists on a cold night in the light of the rising sun. I felt his oppressive aura, the one that had been weighing us down before we even got out of our cars, fade into nothing. I wanted to let out a great big whooping cheer of victory, but given how exhausted I was and how much everything hurt, I settled for the meek yay of victory. I found Winston in the next room and he was fine. He had dislocated his ankle when the stairs collapsed under him, but he had managed to hang onto a bottle of salt, so he drew himself a circle protection just like how I showed him, and he kept Vigo from getting him. Janie called for help and the rescue guys were able to get us out of the basement and to the hospital. We had to explain to them that there had been a severely localized earthquake. It was the only explanation I could come up with for the damage to the house, myself, and Winston. Thanks to the previous client of mine that worked for Winston's insurance company, I was able to arrange for their claims to be paid for quickly and without too many questions. About what exactly happened. The basement stairs will be repaired, the hole in the kitchen will be fixed, and all the ruined furnishing will be replaced. The hidden room will be bricked up too. Each brick was to have a banishing rune carved into it and plenty of holy water mixed into the mortar. We were not leaving anything to chance that Vigo would give us so much trouble. Speaking of chance, while I was recovering in the hospital, Dana went out and bought a lotto ticket for me, like Ego said. Now, I know what you're probably thinking, and no, my ticket did not end up matching all 7 numbers, thus winning the big multi-million-dollar jackpot. It matched 4 of them though, and that was enough to win several grand. I tried to split the winnings with Winston's family. Dana had been the one to buy the ticket after all, but they insisted I keep it all. I'm planning on buying them a very nice house rewarming gift. Maybe a refurbishing of the basement so it's proper living space. Also should probably check into any more hidden rooms while we're at it, just in case. Of course, there's the question of what exactly to do with the rest of the winnings. I won't get into the exact amounts, but it's a fair chunk of change. Not enough to retire, but maybe enough to build something. As I mentioned in the last story, I can't do the official home inspections anymore because of legal BS relating to not being part of a licensed company. So, what if I started my own? I'm still getting requests for helping deal with hauntings, in fact, more now than ever, since sharing my story, and I can't handle them all on my own. Maybe I'll start my own home inspector and business and hire a few folks to help me. Janie still needs a job, and she proved she could handle herself. It seems like a good idea, but I'm also on some really strong painkillers, so I might sit on it for a while. What do you guys think? Any other paranormal stuff going on I should look into? Let me know in the comments. It might lead for some more future stories for me to share. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed. Also, my light went out halfway through. I apologize. I fixed it. But I do hope you enjoyed that story, because I certainly did. Yes, it was a long one, you're right. But I hope you were in for the ride, and I hope you got the conclusion you wanted, because I certainly felt like I wanted a little bit more of a conclusion, and I think we got it. So, if you did enjoy, please come back on Saturday, because we do have scary story video reading book thing. It's not a or/slash NoSleep. It is from a famous book series. And yeah, that will be the end of Whisperween. Fully didn't expect to film this video. Didn't think it was gonna happen. Thought I only had 2 videos. But I really had to read the second part. So, I hope you enjoyed. Didn't address my costume. I'm just wearing a Mario onesie.